This is 22 News in Focus.
Good Sunday afternoon. Welcome to 22 News in Focus. I'm Tamara Sakarzik. Over 3 million people in the United States are living with epilepsy, myself included. There are 150,000 new cases diagnosed every year, but many people still don't really know what epilepsy is. That's what we'll be talking about today on 22 News in Focus. Joining me to talk about this condition is Susan Lin, the president and CEO of the Epilepsy Foundation of New England, and William Murphy, the organization's director of advocacy and public policy. Thank you so much, both of you, for joining us today. So for people who don't really know what epilepsy is, break it down for us.
I think the easiest way to put it is that epilepsy is a neurological disorder, which is like having an electrical storm in the brain. So if you picture the electricity in your home and how sometimes the lights will flicker and sometimes the house will lose power altogether, that's sort of like how epilepsy works. And you see people who are diagnosed as infants, and you see people who are diagnosed as older adults. And you see people who have very severe epilepsy, and you see people who have good seizure control and are living very typical lives. So it's a disorder of the brain, and there are lots of treatment choices available.
And I think what many people don't realize about epilepsy, I was diagnosed in high school, for example, and I just had a grand mal seizure one night. That's pretty common. It's not like, you're born with this a lot of the time, right?
Right. Well, back to what Susan was saying, epilepsy is the fourth most common neurological disorder in the country. 1 out of 26 Americans will be diagnosed with epilepsy. Here in the United States, as you said, 3.4 million. That comes down to more than 71,000 here in Massachusetts, people living with epilepsy. And one thing about epilepsy is it's not a one-size-fits-all disorder. Epilepsy can happen to anyone at any time, at any age. It's most common in the very young. Here in Massachusetts, it's about 8,500 young people living with epilepsy. It's, as I said, it's most common in the very young and in older Americans. Actually, the highest incidence of new cases is now occurring in older Americans, people who've never had a history of epilepsy.
Oh, wow, interesting. And everyone also has different epilepsy triggers. One of my favorite misconceptions is, you can't go to that concert because there's strobe lights, but for me, that's not the case. And for everyone else, it can be different. So can you talk about some of the triggers that people can have?
Sure. So photosensitivity is when people have a seizure because there are strobe lights. That's what that's called. And only 3% of people who have epilepsy have photosensitivity. Triggers, so I would put that in terms of things that decrease your seizure control threshold. And there are really a lot of the things that affect all of our stress and health. So reduced sleep, increased stress, use of alcohol and other drugs, stressful life events, any kind of trauma, could all be things that would trigger a seizure in a person living with epilepsy.
How do people determine what their triggers are? There are various tests.
Go ahead.
Well, there's a number of tests. If it's suspected that a person may be having seizures, they would typically do an EEG, reading of the brain waves. Right. They oftentimes may want to do an MRI or a CAT scan to look to see if there's been structural changes in the brain that could trigger seizures. In other cases, they may want to do blood work to see if there's a metabolic change that could be causing seizures. There's a whole host of reasons why a person could have a seizure. As Susan said, everyone has a seizure threshold. If you go below that seizure threshold for any reason, you could experience a seizure. 1 out of 10 Americans will have a seizure. Epilepsy is a tendency for recurring seizures. And the way they diagnose this, one diagnosis is made, I keep going back to one size doesn't fit all. Right. There's many different types of seizures. The type of seizures will depend on where in the brain those electrical discharges are misfiring. And then how a seizure manifests itself depends on where in the brain those seizures. Some people just have what we call partial seizures, where in the brain it starts will sort of impact how a seizure manifests itself, whether it's a grand mal seizure or a partial seizure, which could just be a sensory experience or a minor motor movement.
And you know what's funny about that is I apparently, when I was diagnosed, was having partial seizures for months, but I was a lacrosse player. I thought something was wrong with the nerve in my leg, and I'll go to the doctor eventually and take care of it, but people have to pay attention to things like that.
I think the epilepsy often goes misdiagnosed. So if you feel like you have a nerve sensation, many doctors' first thought isn't, oh, I wonder if it's epilepsy. It goes to other things. And then in children, a common story that I hear is my child was having a hard time learning and is not paying attention and stares off into space because they're they're being naughty. And staring spells is one type of seizure. So sometimes children go undiagnosed for years and years because no one thinks, oh, I wonder if that's a seizure. It's really hard to spot. So the more awareness we have, the faster we can get folks to see an epileptologist, a neurologist with specialty training in epilepsy, the more likely it is that they can get their seizures under control and live typical normal lives quicker.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, going undiagnosed, oftentimes it's a misdiagnosed, and therefore they don't get the right kinds of treatment. We're very fortunate to be living in a state that's known for major medical centers.
Definitely.
And as Susan mentioned, if epilepsy is suspected, one should see a neurologist. And if the seizures are diagnosed and they're not well controlled, then they should see what we refer to as an epileptologist. And we're very fortunate here in our region to have a number of epileptologists and epilepsy centers who specialize in epilepsy. So you can be assured of greater chances of a proper diagnosis and the most appropriate treatment. But it's having access to that.
If you have epilepsy, it might not be as severe for you as it is for somebody else who has epilepsy. Can you talk about that?
I think it really comes down to what do you want out of your treatment? And what quality of life? I know some people who, obviously we want no seizures and no side effects from medications. That journey can oftentimes be a difficult and time-consuming one. But there's so many different types of seizures, and then the treatment for those seizures will be based on the types of seizures. And fortunately, there's alternatives. But in the course of treatment, in case of treatment, obviously it points out the need for more research. There's still about a third of the folks that none of the available treatments are effective.
Every year we have the Epilepsy Walk in Springfield that the Epilepsy Foundation of New England puts on, and you always hear the stories of the people who have tried every medication and they still have seizures. That starts affecting you after a while, your brain, right?
Yes, when you think about a seizure in the brain, especially depending on how long the seizure is and how much of the brain it affects, it does cause damage over time. It's sort of like when someone has a heart attack and part of their heart actually permanently dies when they have a heart attack. It's like that, but on a slower scale for most people. So it's really important to have seizure control, to get seizures in control, to avoid having damage to the brain.
And how many medications are there for seizures? A ballpark.
It's actually been dramatically on the rise. So the good news for people living with epilepsy is that there's new advances every day. If you were to think about it as a graph over time, the number of seizure medications available in the 70s, 80s, 90s, 2000, and right now in the last decade or so, there's just been huge advances in the types of anti-epileptic drugs available. I can't tell you a number.
It used to be easy to say there's more than 20 types of seizures and more than 20 types of medicines available. I think the number is well over 40 now.
I would concur.
And medication is still the most common and most cost-effective treatment. Unfortunately, as I said, about a third of folks with epilepsy, no effective treatment has yet been found, so the need for research. In addition to medications, then there's surgical treatment. There's devices that are being used to help control seizures, and there's even dietary approach to controlling seizures. We can go into all the detail you want about each of those,
Right.
but I don't want to take up all the time. But we're happy to cover any of those that you would like more information about.
All right, especially the dietary information. We'll get back to that a little bit later on. We'll continue our discussion about epilepsy after a short break. You're watching 22 News in Focus. Welcome back to 22 News in Focus. Today we're talking about epilepsy, a brain condition that causes people to have seizures. We want to get to the topic of CBD because this is something that has been proven to help stop seizures in people with epilepsy, but it's semi-controversial, of course. Go ahead. Whatever you have to say about it.
Much of that controversy really has been removed, fortunately. I have to say, as Director of Advocacy and Public Policy, the epilepsy community and parents and advocates were amongst the first to bring this issue to the forefront many years ago. It was the voice of advocates and parents who got these laws in place, and it prompted the research and discovery of finally an FDA-approved medication based on cannabis, Epidiolex, which is now available in all the states. There has been research, there has been studies, and even perhaps most effectively these anecdotal situations that CBD oil has made dramatic changes for many people living with epilepsy, particularly in younger children when nothing else was working. And that started really a long process. Many folks will say the research isn't there, and that's true because in the past, marijuana, cannabis, was considered in the same class of drugs as heroin and opioids. Through advocacy efforts, we got those laws changed and the classification changed, that researchers now could easily access the plants to do the research. And simultaneously were the situations of CBD oil being found very effective in the treatment of many seizure disorders. Now, I think what's important to remember is the CBD oil that's used for the treatment of epilepsy, and if people are using it, we definitely recommend that it be the medical dispensary grades, not this over-the-counter CBD oil that's available.
And that people who use CBD do it in association, of course, with their healthcare provider. It's not something that you should approach on your own and decide, this is how I might get seizure control. You should definitely do it in consultation with your doctor.
So are there CBD, I guess, types of medications in Massachusetts that you can get at dispensaries, or is this something that has to, I know you mentioned the one that your doctor can prescribe to you.
Right.
Is that the route that you should go?
Well, Epidiolex is the first FDA-approved medication. So that means it's gone through other rigorous clinical trials and testing that any medication, prescription medication, and doctors can prescribe it. The CBD oils, if that is what a person's going to be taking, first it needs to be done in consult with your treating physician, because it can have contraindications with other medications that you may be on, and that's where all the data isn't available. It's not regulated as to what dosage should you take. So the medical marijuana dispensaries, that CBD oil is not as regulated. But the Epidiolex, the FDA-approved medication, as I said, has gone through other rigorous testing that any medication is. So there's consistency and quality control and things, which oftentimes isn't there with the CBD oil, but it has great potential.
And is that for every type of epilepsy, or does that only treat certain types of epilepsy?
Well, Epidiolex is approved for the treatment of Lennox-Gastaut syndrome or Dravet syndrome, which are two severe epilepsies. People living with LGS or Dravet are folks who probably have a significant amount of cognitive impairment and would be considered developmentally delayed or severely developmentally delayed. So the way the language is worded in the FDA approval is for seizures consistent with Lennox-Gastaut or Dravet. The key words there seem to be seizures consistent with. So people who have Lennox-Gastaut or Dravet have what are called highly refractory seizures, meaning that their seizures are in poor control. They have many seizures that haven't responded to other anti-epileptic drugs. And so if you're someone that is struggling with epilepsy and your seizures are poorly controlled, then your seizures may be determined by your healthcare provider to be like those of LGS or Dravet, and then you could qualify for it. So that's a long answer to your question, which is that not everybody qualifies for Epidiolex. And the drug was just approved in September by the FDA and was available on shelves in November. So it's a new process, and we'll see if there's expanded coverage of Epidiolex for other types of epilepsy going forward.
And
I
as
think,
go ahead.
But I think on a practical note too, people need to keep in mind CBD oil as a treatment isn't FDA approved, so your insurance isn't going to cover that.
Right.
And it can be quite expensive.
Right.
Yes, and Epidiolex is FDA approved, so insurance oftentimes will cover that.
The other thing that I was thinking of as somebody who's, a working adult living with epilepsy, if people were to switch jobs, sometimes they get drug tested. Would that show up in a drug test? And if so, could an employer discriminate against you because of that?
Well, CBD oil doesn't contain the THC,
Right.
the hallucinogenic component of cannabis and marijuana that produces the high. So that's not going to show up because of the CBD oil. And as far as drug testing for work, it's not the only drug that may possibly show up. But the whole regulatory process of CBD oil, I think process is the word. They're in process of looking at the regulations. CBD oil now is been reclassified, so it's people used to have concerns about carrying it across state lines and all. At the federal government level, they've reduced that classification, so it's now is legal and is safe to have CBD oil on the plane to cross state lines with it. So it's been looked at in a whole new different way. That's not to say it wouldn't show up in the drug test, but other medications would also be able to show up. And oftentimes you have to disclose why you may be taking that medication, as long as it's a prescribed medication.
Right. So at that point, it would be up to the employer?
We think so. So we had a couple of cases in the past months around people failing a drug test, and it was because they were using medical marijuana or CBD. And in one case, this also has been, in that time where medical marijuana and marijuana are legal in Massachusetts, as you know. And so the company, which is a company that has some headquarters in Boston, but also operates in different parts of the country and the world, had to change its policy in Massachusetts specifically to allow for a difference in how they wouldn't just rule an employee out because they had shown marijuana in their drug test. They'd want to understand from the person what the purpose of the usage was.
Right. It's important to know if they administer a drug test, it has to be across the board to all employees,
Right.
not just select employees.
Right, not just you have epilepsy, so we're
Right.
going to give you a drug test.
Right,
Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah, exactly. And we were also talking about the different dietary options that can also help control seizures for some people, which I always found fascinating. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Sure. So years ago, there were some studies done that showed that children in particular who were placed on the ketogenic diet got better seizure control. At first, it was used with that same group of people who have Lennox-Gastaut syndrome and Dravet syndrome, children who are severely affected and having seizures almost constantly and are very disabled by them. And sure enough, the studies found that children on the ketogenic diet did significantly better than children who were not. And we've seen an increase in awareness of ketogenic in general because people are
now
using
a diet
it.
option.
Yes, people are using it as a diet, so there's a lot more conversation about ketogenic. At the same time, there's a lot more study of the ketogenic diet for other kinds of epilepsy and for adults. So most recently it has been starting to be prescribed for adults, which is exciting opportunity for some people. So again, there's no one size fits all with epilepsy. A ketogenic diet might work for one patient and not the next patient. And to be clear, the ketogenic diet is, I know, trendy right now, but people who are using the ketogenic diet for medical reasons follow a very strict regimen. There is no cheating. Once your body goes into ketosis, where it's burning fat as opposed to carbohydrates, because you're eating a very high protein, very high fat, very low carb or no carb diet, you 1 teaspoon of sugar and you go out of ketosis. If you're a person just doing it because, that's okay, but if you're a person with epilepsy, that could trigger a seizure.
Okay, all right, really interesting stuff. When we come back, we'll learn about how people diagnosed with epilepsy cope with the chronic condition. You're watching 22 News in Focus. You're watching 22 News in Focus. Today we've been talking about epilepsy, a seizure disorder that affects millions of people, and we've been talking about the various ways to control epilepsy. I want to move on to start talking about what's going on at the State House, because there are still so many barriers that people with epilepsy face. So could you briefly talk about the bill?
Bill.
Thanks for the intro. Increasingly in the changing healthcare environment, we're seeing just more and more barriers to people having access to the treatment they need, the access to the specialist, and oftentimes changing through the legislative process is our best hope. And we're not working on these issues all by ourselves all the time. Oftentimes it's with coalition with other chronic condition groups. But 3 issues in particular here in Massachusetts, and actually in the other states that we serve also, are sort of our priorities this year. Our first one is our Seizure Safe School Bill. And what that bill does and why we need it, I think of Colleen every time I think of this bill. Colleen is a young, vibrant, energetic woman who started having seizures in high school. And unfortunately, her school just didn't know enough, and she paid the consequences. The more seizures she had, the more they restricted her. So that her activities were taken away.
Oh, wow.
And then when she had a seizure in the cafeteria, she could no longer eat with her friends in the cafeteria. She had to eat in class by herself. And
What year was this in?
that was when
ago.
I heard when I heard this
Okay.
story, I'm like, wait a minute.
Yeah, what?
And it just was heartbreaking. And yet she still has this stamina and it pushes forward. So I think of Colleen every time I think of why we need this bill. And basically the bill has 3 main components. And it says that all school teachers, all school personnel would be required to have a 1 hour in service that they can take online at their leisure on seizure recognition and appropriate first aid for seizures. And we feel this is important for the 8,400 students who are living with epilepsy and going to school here in Massachusetts. Many schools are doing a fine job. What this bill does is help to have an even playing field across the state. The second part of the bill would require that if a student does have a seizure disorder, they would have a seizure action plan as part of their file at school, and anyone having contact with this student would have access to the seizure action plan, which basically says, this is so-and-so, this is the type of seizure they have, this is what happens when they have a seizure, this is what you should do if a seizure occurs. In the rare case that it becomes a medical emergency, this is what you should do in a medical emergency. And then the third part of it is it assures that all FDA-approved medications, so if a child has epilepsy medications at school, that they would be administered as needed and prescribed by their doctor. So there's 3 main components. I think the most important one is the seizure recognition and training for school personnel, so that what Colleen went through, other students don't have to go through that.
So it's crazy because, like I said, I was diagnosed when I was in high school, and my mom worked at East Long Meadow High School where I went, so she immediately, she was terrified of this. So she had all of my closest friends and my teachers in a room and said, this is what you do if she has a seizure, this is who you call, this is what will happen. But it's hard to imagine that some people don't have that, and yet they still have to go to school every single day and just think, what's going to happen if I have a seizure and I black out? Who's going to react to this, and will they do the right thing? Because there's still so many misconceptions about how to even treat someone if they fall on the ground and have a grand mal seizure.
Right, and the secondary and perhaps the primary benefit of the seizure recognition training and awareness is really to help demystify epilepsy so that these kids, with epilepsy, living with any chronic condition, especially for school-age children, it comes with secondary consequences. And, the sense of being alone, the sense of isolation, can lead to many other problems that are much worse than having a seizure. And that's why, I know we're going to talk about the programs, but I think of our camp programs as the most enabling things for young people with epilepsy.
Talk about them.
Go
ahead, it's time.
I'll let Susan. We started with one camp about 30 years ago. We're up to 19 or 13.
16 camps this year. So yeah, Bill's right. The camp program that Bill helped led the start of, it's just a really wonderful opportunity to bring together young people who share stories and share experience with others who have had the same journey, the same challenges, same hopefully successes. And it's amazing when the kids meet other kids that are affected by epilepsy. So we have so many kids that will say, I never knew anybody had epilepsy before beside me. I thought I was all alone. So our camps range from a one-day program to sleeping away at camp, just like any other camper can, for 6 days. And we have a camp in every state, and we have camps for every ability. So people who are completely disabled and people who are very high functioning, we have something for everyone.
And how do these kids get involved in a camp like that?
It's as easy as going to our website and looking at the camp opportunities and then submitting an information request form. We have a really talented camp administrator who gets in touch with the families. And they do have to fill out an application process. Anyone who has registered a child for camp knows that there's lots of medical forms that have to be submitted per state laws, and we have those plus some additional clearance that the neurologist has to give us of ensuring that the child is appropriate for camp and that we understand the type of seizure that the child has, and that nurses at camp would have what was needed in the event of an emergency at camp.
And I feel like one of the reasons why so many kids have never met other kids with epilepsy is because it's something that a lot of people don't talk about. I've always been very open about it because I think it's an important issue that people should know about, but there's so many people that just shy away from telling other people about it. Do you think this bill that's going through the legislature right now that we were just talking about, that this would help kind of bridge that gap so that you would hear more about it in school and that these kids would feel more comfortable on a daily basis?
But I think, you're correct. Many people don't talk about it. But the minute you start talking about it, other people will say, oh yeah, I know somebody else, and I know somebody else. And remember, 1 in 26 Americans will develop a seizure disorder. So it's very common. And like that song says, the times they are changing. The young people, our youth leadership network, it's these young people and their parents telling their stories of how school is going for them, both good and bad. Many schools, we want to hear where it's going really well and use them as the best case scenarios. The young people feeling empowered, whether it be through camp, the Young Leaders Network, they're finding their voice, they're speaking up, and that's really what I feel is changing the tenor of the conversation and awareness. It's not going to be me just because I have this job title at the State House. It's going to be these young people, students, and their parents who are going to get legislation like this passed and really change the tenor.
Right, very important to talk about. We'll get back to that in just a minute when we continue our conversation after this quick break. You're watching 22 News in Focus. Welcome back to 22 News in Focus. Today we're talking about the diagnosement and treatment of epilepsy. We just spoke about a bill at the State House that would require school personnel to be trained to recognize and respond to seizures, but that's not the only bill that we have going on here in New England. Can you talk about some of the other advocacy efforts?
Well, there's many, so we have to prioritize. Our School Safety Act is certainly in our top 3. Our other 2 are what we call our step therapy bill. It's an example of barriers that insurers put up to limit access to the treatments that people need. So step therapy, quite simply, is your doctor prescribes your medication, in this case to control your seizures, what they feel is best. And your insurer says, well, before we cover that, we want you to try this medication, usually a generic and much cheaper. If you fail on that, then we'll cover the original one. Some insurers are saying you have to do that 2, 3, 4 times.
Which means you could have 2, 3, 4 seizures in which you could injure yourself, somebody else if, God forbid, you're driving.
Exactly.
And seizures can be deadly. They're not often deadly, but there is a phenomenon where people do pass away from seizures.
So step therapy, and then if you change insurance companies and the new company says, let's go back to square one. So basically we're feeling the step therapy limits the parameters on the use of step therapy, putting the decision making back in the hands of the patients and the doctors. So there's the step therapy bill. We're thrilled that we're waiting any day for the governor in Maine to sign our bill that just passed up there. And we just heard this week that in Rhode Island, their Senate passed the bill 36-0. So now we're on here in Massachusetts, and we'll have hearings on that. The second is an issue called non-medical switching. And all these terms have simple meanings. Non-medical switching is when in the middle of the year, the insurance company changes the coverage and the benefits that you have. So in case of our folks, there was a gentleman whose copay went from $40. He got notified mid-month that next month his copay is going to go from $40 to $1,000.
Which is insane.
For his one epilepsy medication.
Mind-boggling.
So again, that our bill would put limits on that. So those are our 3 top issues. But, again, these bills only pass when people share their stories. Right. And I invite anybody living with epilepsy or family members to please contact the foundation if they're willing to speak with their legislators about how important these issues are to them. And we need a strong cadre of advocates. And I'm going to lead in to say our advocates mostly come from the programs that the foundation, the growing roster of programs that we offer at the foundation.
And the foundation is such a large community, and it really does so much for people with epilepsy. So can you talk about some of those programs?
Sure, yeah. We have something for everyone, I'd like to say, and what we're really working on at the Epilepsy Foundation of New England is enabling a circle of support. We think it's so important, and there's research that shows this, that when people have community and they're living with epilepsy and other chronic health conditions, and they feel like they have a social network and other people who understand, who can talk with them about what they're going through, that it has a profound effect on their short-term and long-term, not only mental health and emotional health, feeling good, but also on their physical health. They're more likely to stay in compliance with treatments, etc. So to that end, we have an array of youth programs. In addition to camps, we have a Young Leaders Network that convenes high school and college age students in community service and leadership and advocacy. We have a similar program called Kids Connect for middle school students, which is a little bit more focused on recreation, but younger group. In our Resource and Support Center, we have a help desk. People can call us and ask any question they have about epilepsy as often as they want, and we will try to help them and connect them with resources. We have a scholarship program where we help high school students who are trying to go on to further training and education. We have an emergency aid program for families that are having a financial setback because of an epilepsy-related situation. We will provide them a one-time grant to help them out of their financial crisis. We have a career navigator program that helps people with epilepsy to get and retain work. We have an extensive community education and outreach program. So if you want us to come talk with you about epilepsy at your workplace or at the police department or in schools, you name it, if you would like a training on epilepsy, we are here for you, providing free trainings all over New England. And advocacy and public policy is such an important part of our work. And the other main thing that we do is we do fundraise for research because, as Bill said before, for 30% of people living with epilepsy, there is no effective treatment, in addition to which 1 in 150 people with poor seizure control pass away each year of epilepsy, which is a little known fact. And so we need to do more to change those numbers.
And with all of these various types of programs that you have, how does somebody decide which program is right for them? Is there somebody from the foundation who can kind of guide them, or a place where they can read about them?
Absolutely. So at our website, epilepsynewengland.org, you'll find tons of information about the services we provide, but we encourage you to call. Our numbers are there. Call the main office, call our camp administrator or our resource and support specialist, or call me, and we're happy to try to help you find the program and service that meets your needs.
I also think the fundraising part of this is so critical because there's so many diseases out there that you see these fundraisers for, and we've all heard people say, what are they using the money for? But especially in this case and like so many other diseases like epilepsy, it's really critical at this point.
Absolutely. We only can operate because of the generosity of supporters, and whether people give $5 or hold a clothing drive for us or write us a check for, that has a lot of zeros on it, all of it makes such a big difference. We have grown in size over the past 3 years. We've almost quadrupled in size in terms of the offerings we have, and we've done that thanks to being able to almost triple the amount of donations coming into the foundation. So we're incredibly grateful to our supporters, and thank you for mentioning that.
Of course. And with some of these other programs, are there any types of activities that are challenging for especially kids that have epilepsy, particularly if it's not being controlled by medication?
You mean activities that they can participate in?
Yeah, are there like activities that the foundation helps with that are geared towards people who might not be able to do everything?
Well,
you can both go.
Not that we both don't have much to say.
I know. Well, you can talk forever about epilepsy, but our programs are, especially our camp programs, are geared to have children and youth, and in some cases adults, try things that you wouldn't normally associate people with epilepsy doing, because there's always an adaptation. Mm-hmm. Almost always an adaptation. So swimming is one where generally if you have epilepsy or seizures, you probably shouldn't be swimming alone.
Right.
And for some children who are having regular seizures, they should have a life jacket on at all times. And at our camp program, we swim, we boat, we tube, we do all that. We have a rock climbing wall. People don't always think, this is so good to be up so high. But the truth is you're harnessed in, you have a helmet on. Mm-hmm. We have an extensive horseback riding program because people think, should you be on a horse? Because if you have a seizure, you could fall off. But we have sidewalkers to ensure that if someone has a seizure, that they're safe. And then most recently, last year and this year, we've added a sailing program. Because some people think, oh, I have epilepsy, boating can't be for me. And it can be. It's just we have to work together to adapt to help people achieve. And I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off. Was there something else that you wanted to say?
I was going to say the same thing, and also goes right back to, it's not a one-size-fits-all disorder. I think in many people's minds, they're like, oh, people with epilepsy can't drive. The majority of people with epilepsy who can achieve seizure control can drive. People with epilepsy can't work at heights. Well, if there's the safety harnesses, they have a ball doing it. I often say too, especially like in a gym situation and in a school situation, if someone's activities are restricted, it's upon us to find an alternative activity for them. So the vast majority of activities folks with epilepsy are able to participate in, oftentimes with accommodations, but they can participate.
All right. What's it like to live with epilepsy? Our next guest will share her story. You're watching 22 News in Focus. Today we've been talking about the diagnosis and treatment of epilepsy and the work the Epilepsy Foundation of New England does. Having a seizure, I can tell you right now, can be a terrifying experience as somebody who has lived with epilepsy, and having multiple seizures and dealing with the side effects can really be debilitating both physically and mentally. Joining me now to talk about her personal experience living with epilepsy is Bridget Drummy. She's a senior at Longmeadow High School and a good friend of mine. Bridget, when were you diagnosed with epilepsy, and what was that experience like for you?
So I was 3 years old when I was diagnosed with epilepsy, so I don't remember much of like what exactly happened, but from what my parents have told me, they saw me having a seizure, like I was shaking and I was drooling, and they were like, okay, like something is wrong. So I went to the doctors and they were like, yeah, she's having a seizure, and they sent me right to the hospital.
So you basically lived your entire life for the most part with epilepsy, and you're one of the ones who it hasn't been completely controlled on medication, right?
Yes.
What has that been like for you?
It hasn't been easy. So like because my seizures haven't been controlled, I can't drive. So that has definitely been difficult in terms of like looking for colleges and stuff. I had to make sure that I was in an urban area where there's public transportation and like I'm near a hospital. But like for me, so most of my seizures happen at night. So luckily it doesn't affect my day-to-day life as much, but it still affects, my ability to drive and kind of to be independent, I guess.
Right. So now that you're going off to college, what's going through your head about all of this? Because I remember when I was going off to college, I think my parents were way more scared than I was, but I remember it being, kind of scary to think about what's the next 4 years going to look like and what happens if I have a seizure in college classroom somewhere on the college campus. So what has it been like for you preparing for this?
I'm not gonna lie, it's pretty scary, but I mean, luckily my school is right near the hospital that I go to, like where my neurologist is. So I know like if something were to happen, I would be right there. So I have that security, but it's pretty daunting.
And can you talk about what you're doing in college? Because I just love this about you.
I'm a biology major, and I'm hoping to become a pediatric neurologist someday.
Why pediatric neurologist?
Well, I'd like to help people with epilepsy. So.
And living with epilepsy your entire life, when did you decide that this is what I want to do? This is, my life calling?
Well, I've always kind of been interested in the sciences, but 2 years ago, I went to the hospital for a long-term monitoring thing. They were trying to test if I was a surgery candidate, and that's kind of when I realized that all the doctors were coming in. I'm like, oh my gosh, this is so cool. Like, this is what I want to do. So.
Yeah. And with your experience with the doctors, have you always had really good experiences? Do you think the role that neurologists play for people with epilepsy is so important? Can you talk about how that has helped you over the years?
Yeah, for the most part, I've had really great doctors. Definitely, when you're first diagnosed, most people know nothing about epilepsy, so having a good neurologist is really important.
And being in high school and living with epilepsy, we were talking earlier about certain activities that, people might not be able to do. Was there ever anything that you couldn't do or things you had to kind of, I guess, modify?
Not really. For gym class, we do like a swimming unit, and I swim, so I was allowed to do the class, but I noticed there was a teacher always keeping an eye on me and stuff, and they were always very nervous about me having a seizure.
Which is kind of a good thing.
Yes, no, it is a good thing. But
so did you personally decide to tell all of your teachers about it, or did all of your teachers know about it?
They did know. I think I told many of them, but I'm pretty sure that they when they get their list of students, they it says this person has epilepsy or whatever, and it's just so they're aware if something were to happen.
How have your friends reacted to it over the years? Because I know that the social aspect can be scary. I mean, I remember, still to this day, people will say, oh my God, what do I do if you have a seizure?
Yeah.
Calm down, it's just epilepsy.
I've been really lucky. I've had some really great friends that have been very supportive. I mean, as long as they've known me, I've had epilepsy. So I never really had that moment where I had that big change in my life and was okay, I have epilepsy now, how do I deal with this? It's just kind of a part of who I am.
What are some of the misconceptions about epilepsy that you've had to go through over the years?
Well, people think that people with epilepsy they're so different and stuff like that, when really we're just normal people, but we have really fast electrical impulses in our brain, and sometimes we kind of lose control a little bit. People think that I can't go to a concert or whatever because of the flashing lights and just different stereotypes like that. If I have a seizure, I'll swallow my tongue and things like that.
Right. Or that they should put something in your mouth if you're having a seizure, which you do not do. Because,
no.
So there's a lot of misconceptions. What have you done to kind of break through the barriers there and correct the misconceptions? Are you pretty open about telling people
I mean, I've just kind of explained to my friends and stuff, this is what will happen, this is what you do. And just like other kids, like I work at a camp over the summer, and like the people that I work with, I had to like, explain to them, like, if I have a seizure, this is what happens. And it's just important to make sure everyone you're around kind of knows what to do.
For other people that are your age or maybe younger than you that have epilepsy, and as we both know, that can be a really tough time,
Sure.
especially when you're just diagnosed, what would you tell them about living with epilepsy?
I'm not gonna lie, it's not easy, but you will get through it, and there's lots of doctors that are there to help you, and there's so many different treatments now, and that it will get better at some point.
And I know many of the people at home are probably wondering that don't know a lot about epilepsy, what it's actually like to have a seizure. When's the last time you remember having a seizure, and how can you describe that experience?
Last time I remember having a seizure was probably 2 weeks ago.
Wow, so
And
recent.
Yeah, my seizures, they're nocturnal, so they happen at night. And they happen pretty frequently, but because they happen while I'm sleeping, it's hard to know exactly when I'm having them. But I don't know, I think it's different for everyone, but for me personally, it feels like what I would imagine it would feel like to get electrocuted. Like, not as painful, but like you can feel like the electricity, like kind of inside your body, and like that brain stimulation.
Right, it's painful and then it's not painful.
Yeah.
Is how I remembered from the last time I had a seizure. Knowing what it feels like, what would you like to tell people at home, if anything, about if they see somebody having a seizure, how they should react to it?
I think it's just important to make sure the person doesn't injure themselves. So to make sure, if they're around furniture or whatever, to move all of that out of the way and just kind of watch them. And if you realize that it's going on for a long time and maybe they need medical attention, and just to make sure that they're breathing. Yeah.
Okay, well, Bridget, thank you so much, and best of luck to you in
Thank
college.
you.
I know that you'll go on and do great things. We'll have the last word for you after the break. Stay with us. You're watching 22 News in Focus. Today, we've been talking about the diagnosis and treatment of epilepsy and the work that the Epilepsy Foundation of New England does. That's our program for today. We want to thank all of our guests for joining us, and thank you at home for watching. If you missed any of today's show, you can watch it in full on our website, wwlp.com. From all of us here at 22 News, we wish you a wonderful Sunday. Bye.